Welcome to part 2 of our interview with Dr. Daniel Pfau, a queer neuroendocrinologist who first questioned the idea of gender and identity by observing the sexual behavior of beetles. In part 1, Dr. Pfau explained how their own findings were inconsistent with what some researchers and studies were trying to tell them.
Like I said, that there was these aspects of biology that just didn't make sense. They didn't quite get to an experience that could explain them in my thinking, basically. And I think one of the really good papers that I came across early that sort of showed me this was a friend of mine who had published a paper, and they are sort of they work mostly in psychology, and so they had really delved into this idea of whether or not expressing something like same-sex sexual behavior would actually lead to a decrease in the amount of reproduction that's going on. So basically, like, okay, this animal all of a sudden is expressing same-sex sexual behavior. Does that mean it's no longer expressing different sex sexual behaviors and that it can no longer reproduce?
The paper they are referencing is called Oversimplifying Evolutionary Psychology Leads to Explanatory Gaps by Dr. J. Better Garcia and Dr. Charlotte Tate.
When I first came across it, this sort of idea that, they had presented that we were thinking about things a certain way, but we don't always have to think about them that way, sort of stuck with me. Yeah, there are people out there who are seeing this unique world that I saw and saying to themselves, like, okay, wait a second, let's step back and let's make sure we're actually looking at the complexity and holding all that complexity.
Dr. Pfau's next eureka moment came while taking a college course, but instead of the beetles they were looking at before, this time it was mice.
This mouse model where they removed a specific gene and the mice started to show same-sex sexual behavior. So the male mice would actually mount males, and the female mice, which typically don't show mounting behavior, did start mounting, and they would mount both males and females. And they'd also obviously show the sexual behaviors that would lead to reproduction as well.
The gene they removed from the mice was called TRPC2.
And then when the next bit of information I've got, for some reason, for me, made so much sense, but for many people just didn't. And it was that humans lost this gene, the TRPC2 gene, a long time ago during our evolution, about 25 million years ago.
Humans weren't exactly around 25 billion years ago. But Dr. Pfau says it may have been a small mammal that humans evolved from.
The idea basically being that it's some ancient creature, not at all like humans. And in this organism, there was this gene, and when it was lost, it was at that point that the creature would be able to express the same-sex sexual behavior. And that's what makes sense in my mind. Like, okay, take it away from a mouse, they express same-sex sexual behavior. Take it away from a human ancestor, there they go. They're expressing same-sex sexual behavior. But when I tell people this, they'd be like, oh, well, we don't have the TRPC2 gene, so it doesn't apply to us. I'm like, yeah, no, I said that. It applies to our ancestor. And so there was this, even at the get-go of this, I could see there was this sort of disconnect between wanting to talk about something that sort of influenced us, but sort of started way before this sort of concept of queer community, and really just sort of having to separate those two ideas was something that I can see now was sort of one of the driving issues of why people sort of had a difficulty understanding sort of what I was saying when I got to a certain point. And so what I was hoping to do with this paper was to really, as you say, there's just tons of biological information. And so what I was really hoping to do was sort of just spew it all out there and be like, hey, this is directly each step I took to sort of try and get to this point of saying that, it's a complicated story.
But why does the absence of the gene cause the animals to show same-sex behaviors?
So if we were to assume that mice and our ancestral primates were the same, they would both be expressing aggression towards males because of the scent and showing sexual behavior towards females because of their scent. The loss of this gene disrupts the ability of that olfactory system. And no longer are they able to just say, okay, I automatically am going to do this based on this signal. And that doesn't mean that they can't detect whether or not it's a male or female. But what it means is that there was a system that sort of put this in stone. It was sort of a behavioral paradigm that was set up because of its presence, because of the presence of the pheromone, because of the presence of the behavior, and because of the presence of this gene. And all those things had to happen together for this sort of complicated behavioral paradigm, which was aggress towards males and have sex with females for a male. And then obviously for females, you end up with a little bit more complicated because they'll aggress towards a male that is not their mate. And then they'll also be able to show sexual receptivity to a male.
But this idea led to some complications. Some people began to wonder if the loss of the gene could have led to the creation of a gay ancestor and a straight ancestor.
That really can't be done because we're losing a gene for one, which means everything that's after is the same for everyone. So there's no way that this created, two separate species or even alleles, because it's the loss of a gene.
Every gene that makes up our bodies has two copies, one from each parent. These are called alleles, and they ultimately make up our phenotypes, or our outward appearances. Your mom has blue eyes, and your dad has brown. Those alleles caused you to have the phenotype for brown eyes. But what can also lead to diversity in humans are selection pressures, or outside influences.
How selection pressures interact with each of those aspects can lead to a diversity of changes. And so without having the ability to interact with sort of diverse sexual partners, we wouldn't be able to see all these sort of diverse identities today, because in order for new alleles to develop that would allow for the expression of those sort of phenotypes, those identities, those experiences, there has to be some sort of allele that appeared, which is a gene difference. And for that gene difference to appear, we need to have something acting on it. And if you don't have any other diversity in sexual partner except for, different sex organisms, then those types of alleles just wouldn't appear. And especially when we're talking about sort of the evolution of queer identities, this has to have taken place way after that, because, within queer identities, we have all this multitude of experiences, whether it be on levels of romantic attraction to sexual attraction, to desires of multiple partners, or a desire for monogamy. So all these differences sort of have to have come from some diversity in our genetics being acted upon by these various selection pressures. And so to me, it just made sense that there had to have been something really happening a really long time ago for so much diversity to appear now.
So, how does this all relate back to humans?
There was a really big study done recently looking at genetics between individuals. It was looking at two sexes, so men and women, and then it was looking at 3 different orientations. So they were looking at bisexuals, heterosexuals, and homosexuals.
The research shows that some alleles were showing up more frequently in certain communities.
For example, like in homosexual men, there might be an allele that shows up at much higher levels than in the other groups. And so one idea that comes from this is how could these alleles have appeared without the selection pressures that could lead to their development? And so that's sort of the idea of my paper, that we need to accept a sufficiently nuanced explanation of our behavior as far back as, this ancestor, in order to truly understand and hold the complexity of actual human experiences.
One of the biggest takeaways from Dr. Pfau's research is to keep an open mind when it comes to the human species. There really are no simple explanations for everything.
People sort of want, when they're hearing a biologist talk, to be like, oh yeah, it's this percentage genetics and this percentage environment and nature, nurture. And to me, it's sort of immaterial to humans because of how long our development extends. We truly have so many aspects of nature and nurture interacting. I like to think of it sort of like as this Plinko board where you sort of drop a disc at the top and it can go down and will sort of go out, and like I was explaining, there's phenotypes. And so in science, we often like limit things and say like male and female. So we drop our Plinko thing and we study each of the steps that eventually will lead you to male or female. And that is truly a model. And I always love to say that, all models are useful, but they're wrong. And so it's a useful idea, male and female, but it's ultimately wrong. And so I think a lot of scientists are finally really opening up to the idea that rather than sort of saying, we have male and female, or we have more than male and female, but to rather say like, sex is complicated. It's not any one thing. And to move away from that positionality, I think is really scary for scientists.
Dr. Pfau's relationship with the studies has been rocky. It was difficult to trust science when all the research that was presented to them went directly against everything they were feeling.
I really did not know or believe that a queer community existed beyond sort of this community of individuals working through their sin and, eventually coming out on the other end. And so that was sort of one of the reasons why I felt a difficult connection with the scientific community was that when through this process, I was shown like the scientific research that supported the notion that you could actually change your sexual orientation. And this was sort of stuff presented at, a scientific conference. And so at the time, and this is back in like 2000, early 2000s. And so at the time, I had no ability to push back against that, aside from, my little Beatles and my garage that sort of confused me. And so the only way I had to push back against it was sort of wanting the things that I did desire and feeling like, like, how could this be wrong if this is what I'm feeling? And so, but I mean, it took forever to get to that point.
Dr. Pfau came out to a Christian counselor when they were 14. The counselor advised them to go to conversion therapy, where they would supposedly push the gay away.
It was really all about this idea that any same-sex attraction that I had was only related to sort of the sexual aspect, and that, any aspect that I thought was going to be something I wanted from a same-sex relationship could also be gotten from from basically being a heterosexual. And the idea, I think, that really drove that and allows that for individuals to sort of claim is that they feel all these systems for our relationships were developed with the idea of heterosexuality in mind. So when you think about it as a scientist, it's a rather crazy concept to basically be like, evolution, it's there to support heterosexuality. Of course, why would it do anything else? But when you really think of it as a biologist, like that just doesn't make sense. It was just holding the complexity of evolution and not letting ourselves be struck by, sort of the simplicity of just saying, oh yeah, heterosexuality leads to babies. The most, like, it's just such a easy thing then for a scientist to say then, oh yeah, well, if heterosexuality is how we get babies, then that's all that our evolution would be selecting for. But I mean, obviously that's not true. There's tons of queer individuals that have children. On top of that, like, if that were the case, then why are queer individuals able to reproduce at all? And I mean, these are sort of some of the questions that sort of push back at that idea. But I think the thing that really pushes back the most is this idea that these systems evolved independently of like these directed sexual behaviors. We didn't evolve a sexual drive that's a heterosexual drive and a homosexual drive. We have sex drives. We didn't develop these separate sort of aspects of relationships.
Dr. Pfau hopes that going forward, science can focus more on input from communities. They want to make sure that the queer community has a say and feels represented by science rather than alienated.
Oh my goodness, everyone in the queer community, tell me what you think sex is. And I'm like, yay, let's add that in. And for them, it's like, wait, that's too much, too fast. And, it's something that I think is happening more and more. But there's also, I think, sort of going to have to be this reckoning in science where we start to value the experiences of the individuals we're discussing in terms of how we develop our theories. And I don't mean just sort of asking what they think, but making sure that they have a chance to look at what we're creating and say like, oh yeah, I see myself in that, or no, I don't see myself in that. And so you need to change that. And I think also just learning how to hold that complexity too, learning how to be able to say to one individual, like, okay, yeah, they conceptualize it this way, and you say that's not at all how you conceptualize that. How can we hold both those as truthful within biology? And I truly believe that is the way for really the queer community to be empowered by science. I honestly do feel like for some individuals, it's very helpful to sort of be able to look at science and say, hey, like, I understood in the past that my identity was this way, or I understood it, or I had difficulties accepting my identity because of X, Y, and Z. And then they maybe look in the science and be able to say, okay, well, there's sort of this idea out there that sort of helps me personally.
But even science has its limits, especially when it comes to explaining the origins of gender identities.
And part of it is because it's not something science is capable of doing, in a sense. So we have like all these studies about brain scans and things like that. But really, we don't exactly know what's going on in those. Oftentimes they're interpreted in very succinct ways, but it's a lot more hand-wavy, I think, than people realize.
Dr. Pfau says the research going forward should stop questioning what the queer community is.
And instead move to like, okay, we are what we are. Let's examine this amazing diversity and understand that.
And a step further is looking into studies and research that can directly benefit LGBTQ+ individuals, like improving hormone replacement therapy for the trans and non-conforming communities.
So individuals, for example, who have Parkinson's, they have tons of mouse models to study how we can better serve them through healthcare, through medicine. But when we're talking about like the queer community, there are so few examples of this. And one of the researchers that I'm really looking forward to working with in the future is at University of Michigan, Hadrian Kinnear, and he's looking at specifically, he has 2 papers out that are just looking at mice and treating them with hormone replacement therapy. So trying to mimic that, which is given to humans in a rodent model, and just sort of making this mouse model of hormone replacement therapy. And those are the types of things that really are going to lead to the queer community benefiting from science. But I also, in a sense, feel like that's an actual way in which scientists can accept our identities without having to, say they do it through research, by, accepting the fact that we have unique needs that should be addressed in research. It's basically saying like our needs and our identities are being affirmed and validated. It's our lived experiences that need to be improved. And so there's just been, I think, this really great push lately to really question what science is being done and for the queer community.
Dr. Pfau is currently finalizing an article to describe their findings, alongside their co-author and PhD advisor, Dr. Cynthia Jordan, and Dr. Mark Breedlove. To connect with Dr. Pfau, you can follow their Twitter at EndoQueer, spelled Kweer. That's ENDOKWEER. And find their blog, Queering Science, on Psychology Today at the link in their Twitter bio. Thanks for watching. Pride is a production of Straw Hut Media. If you like the show, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter @Pride, and tune in weekly for new episodes. Be sure to share this episode with your friends and subscribe to our podcast too for more great queer stories. You can follow me @Levi Chambers. Pride is produced by me, Levi Chambers, Maggie Bowles, and Ryan Tillotson. Written by Caitlin McDaniel. Edited by Sebastian Alcala and Daniel Ferreira. Sound mixing by Sebastian Alcala. That's why you were really, really into, I've already forgotten it with my goldfish brain,
neuroendocrinology.
Yes, that's why.
That's
because you're like, I'm not watching the Brady Bunch. I'm not watching TV. I'm studying. Okay, continue.
Straw Hut Media.